My mother-in-law told the wedding host that I was just a server. I smiled, set the gift down without a word, and stepped back into the crowd like I was invisible. Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and the celebration carried on until someone noticed the card attached to the box. A name. A detail they should not have ignored. The music faltered. Voices dropped. And when the lid was finally lifted, every smile in the room disappeared. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and I am the woman who bought the very ground my enemies stood on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic in-laws exactly who holds the power. I sit here now cross-legged on an emerald green velvet sofa in my penthouse. The space around me is minimalist, sharp, and silent, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I unleashed just a few hours ago. I gently swirl a glass of vintage red wine, watching the dark liquid coat the fine crystal. The city lights of Atlanta stretch out below me, through floor-to-ceiling windows shimmering like scattered diamonds across the skyline. Down there, people are scrambling. Down there, reputations are burning to the ground in spectacular fashion. Up here, it is perfectly quiet. I take a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, complex taste ground me in this moment of victory. It is funny how arrogant people consistently underestimate you when you do not speak loudly, when you do not wear your bank account balances on your sleeve, when you come from the gritty working-class neighborhoods they so desperately try to avoid and erase. My mother-in-law Beatrice thought my silence was weakness. She thought my patience was a permanent state of submission. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy playing dress-up in foreclosed mansions and drowning in hidden debt, I was busy buying the very bank that held her financial life in its hands. But to truly appreciate the masterpiece of her destruction, we have to go back to the beginning of the evening, to the exact moment she sealed her own fate at my sister-in-law Chloe's wedding. The air inside the Grand Oak mansion was thick with the suffocating scent of imported white orchids and the lively, arrogant rhythm of a live jazz band playing in the corner. The estate was a breathtaking monument to Southern elite wealth, boasting soaring marble columns, sweeping grand staircases, and massive crystal chandeliers that cast a golden, buttery light over the crowded ballroom. It was exactly the kind of venue Beatrice required to validate her desperate lifelong need for social supremacy. Tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her entire existence. Her daughter Chloe was marrying Julian, a wealthy white man from a highly prominent old money family. For Beatrice, this marriage was never really about love or partnership. It was a hostile acquisition. It was a golden ticket into the exclusive, untouchable circles she had spent decades clawing her way toward, a desperate attempt to prove to Atlanta's high society that her family belonged at the very top of the social hierarchy. I walked into the main hall wearing a custom-tailored haute couture gown that whispered of quiet, untouchable wealth. It was beautifully understated, completely devoid of the flashy, recognizable logos that Beatrice and Chloe always favored, but anyone with a truly trained eye would know its exorbitant worth immediately. My heels clicked softly against the polished hardwood floor, blending with the clinking of glasses and the low hum of affluent conversation. I was simply making my way toward my assigned seating area, fully intending to endure the long evening, eat the overpriced catered food, and go home to my peaceful sanctuary. I had absolutely no intention of causing a scene. Over the years, I had grown deeply accustomed to fading into the background at these pretentious family events, preserving my mental energy for corporate boardrooms rather than wasting it on their petty manufactured dramas. But peace is never a viable option when you are married into a family that views your very existence as a stain on their carefully curated pedigree. As I navigated through the dense sea of designer tuxedos and extravagant evening gowns, I saw her, Beatrice. She was a woman of 60, but pulled unnaturally tight by expensive cosmetic procedures, draped in heavy emerald silk, and wearing a forced, radiant smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She was hovering near the center of the room, completely monopolizing Julian's mother, Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who radiated generations of undisturbed privilege, her posture stiff and impeccably polite, her smile tight, with the condescension of someone who knew exactly how hard Beatrice was trying to impress her. The moment Beatrice's eyes darted frantically across the room and landed on me, I saw the sheer, unadulterated panic flash vividly across her face. Her perfectly manicured hands twitched at her sides. To her, my presence was a walking, breathing liability. She knew I grew up on the rougher side of town, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts. She knew I did not pledge the right college sorority or attend the right elite cotillions growing up. In her deeply twisted, classist mind, allowing Julian's aristocratic white family to engage in even a brief conversation with me would instantly expose the cracks in her flawless high society facade. That initial panic instantly hardened into a cold, vicious, and deeply familiar malice. Beatrice did not hesitate for a single second. As a catering waiter walked past her carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with tall crystal flutes of champagne, she reached out and snatched it right out of his hands. The young waiter stumbled back in absolute shock, but Beatrice was already moving with terrifying purpose. She stepped directly into my path, physically blocking me from Mrs. Sterling's line of sight like a human shield. Before I could even open my mouth to offer a standard polite greeting to my new extended in-laws, Beatrice shoved the heavy metal tray forcefully against my chest. The amber liquid sloshed dangerously near the delicate rims of the crystal flutes, threatening to spill completely over my expensive dress. My hands flew up by pure conditioned reflex to catch the heavy silver edges before the glasses could shatter loudly on the marble floor and cause a massive scene. "Oh, please forgive her, Mrs. Sterling." Beatrice trilled her voice, pitching up into a sickeningly sweet theatrical laugh that echoed far too loudly over the smooth jazz music. "She is just with the catering staff. You know how absolutely impossible it is to find good, educated help these days. She simply does not know the rules or where she belongs." The music seemed to dull to a muffled hum in my ears. The conversations immediately around us paused as heads turned to watch the interaction. Mrs. Sterling offered a thin, highly uncomfortable smile, her eyes sweeping over me from head to toe with a toxic mixture of mild disdain and absolute dismissal. She did not see a daughter-in-law. She did not see an equal standing before her. Thanks to Beatrice's loud public declaration, she saw exactly what she was told to see: an uneducated, clumsy servant who had foolishly wandered too close to the master's table. Beatrice shot me a look so venomous, so heavily laced with unspoken warning and utter disgust, that it could have frozen boiling water on contact. Her eyes widened slightly silently, daring me to speak up and defend myself. She was challenging me to drop the heavy tray, to loudly claim my actual place as her son's wife, to ruin her perfectly orchestrated performance in front of the wealthy white in-laws she so desperately worshipped. She wanted to humiliate me into total submission. She wanted to remind me that no matter who I married or how hard I worked, I would always be the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks, entirely unfit to sit at their prestigious table. She fully expected me to shrink into myself. She expected me to flush bright red with deep embarrassment, to stutter out a pathetic defense, or to flee the ballroom in tears of shame. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even take a deep breath to steady myself. I simply looked straight into Beatrice's eyes, holding her frantic, hateful gaze with a terrifying, absolute calm that seemed to unnerve her for a split second. The air between us crackled with a dark, unspoken tension. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of her pathetic desperation hiding beneath her cloying, expensive perfume. I felt the cool, solid weight of the silver tray grounding my hands, tethering me to reality. I adjusted my grip smoothly, ensuring the crystal flutes were perfectly balanced and pristine. I offered a flawless, deferential nod to Mrs. Sterling, playing the degrading part assigned to me with absolute chilling perfection. And then I accepted the tray, turning away without uttering a single word. The heavy silver tray bit into my palms, the condensation from the crystal flutes dampening my skin. I moved through the crowded ballroom, my posture immaculate, my expression wiped completely clean of the cold fury burning in my chest. Around me, the elite of Atlanta mingled with Julian's old money relatives. The air was a suffocating blend of expensive cologne custom floral arrangements and the hollow ringing sound of fake laughter. I navigated through the sea of silk and tailored velvet, playing the invisible server to absolute perfection. Nobody looked at my face. To them, I was just a pair of hands offering overpriced champagne. That is the true magic of high society. They are so obsessed with titles and bloodlines that they never bother to look at the people holding their drinks. I glided past conversations about stock portfolios and summer homes, my eyes scanning the room for the one person who was supposed to be my partner in this life. I found him near the grand ice sculpture. Marcus, 34 years old, effortlessly handsome, and wearing a bespoke tuxedo that I had paid for. He was holding court with a group of Julian's wealthy uncles and several prominent local businessmen. He held a glass of dark amber bourbon in one hand, gesturing broadly with the other, playing the role of the successful, highly educated financial prodigy. He wore his university alumni pin on his lapel like a shield projecting an image of absolute dominance and generational wealth. But I knew the truth. I knew the man inside that suit was nothing more than a terrified hollow shell desperately trying to keep up appearances. I walked directly toward his group. The crystal flutes on my tray clinked softly in time with the jazz band playing on the main stage. I stopped just a few feet away from him. I did not speak. I did not interrupt his animated story about the current real estate market. I simply stood there holding the tray waiting. I gave him a choice. I gave my husband one final fleeting opportunity to be a man. All he had to do was look at me, recognize his wife take the heavy silver tray from my hands, and tell his arrogant mother that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. All he had to do was say, "This is my wife and we are leaving." Marcus turned his head. His eyes met mine. Time seemed to slow down in that heavily perfumed air. I saw the immediate visceral shock register on his handsome face. He saw me holding the catering tray. He saw the servant role his mother had publicly forced upon me. He knew exactly what had just happened in the foyer. The realization hit his eyes, followed instantly by a raw, suffocating panic. For a fraction of a second, he froze. He looked at me, looked at the wealthy white investors hanging on his every word, and then made the defining choice of his miserable life. He turned away. He casually shifted his shoulders, offering me his back, and burst into a loud artificial laugh at a joke no one had even made. He raised his bourbon glass to the men around him, stepping slightly to the side to physically block me from his circle, pretending with every ounce of his pathetic being that he did not know the woman standing right behind him. He turned away. Just like how cowardly he hid when I had to sign a $100,000 check to pay off his gambling debts last year. My mind flashed back to that humiliating night in our kitchen. He had been weeping on the floor, begging me to save him from the loan sharks who were threatening to break his legs and expose his massive hidden debts to his prestigious friends. He had sworn on his life that he would change, that he would spend the rest of his days protecting me, cherishing me, honoring the vows we had taken. I had written that massive check to buy his safety, to protect the family name his mother was so obsessed with. And now, when all he had to do was acknowledge my presence and defend my basic human dignity, he shrank into the shadows of his own fragile ego. The last microscopic thread of affection I held for Marcus snapped cleanly in two. There was no sadness left. There was no heartbreak. There was only a cold, clinical certainty. I was looking at a dead man walking. I did not fight back. I did not drop the tray or cause the screaming scene they were all terrified I might unleash. I simply adjusted my grip on the silver handles and continued walking. I glided past my husband without a second glance, completely erasing his existence from my emotional radar. I was a woman on a mission, and I had a job to do. I made my way to the very center of the ballroom, navigating toward the grand head table reserved exclusively for Julian's immediate family. This was the VIP section, draped in cascading white orchids and set with gold-rimmed porcelain. Julian's relatives sat around the table, their postures stiff with generational wealth. speaking in hushed, polite tones that completely ignored the bustling event staff around them. I approached the table with a serene, flawless smile. I lowered the tray smoothly, offering the chilled champagne flutes to Julian's aunts and uncles. They took the glasses without looking at my face, offering tight, dismissive nods of acknowledgement. I played the obedient server to absolute perfection, my movements crisp, silent, and entirely invisible. I cleared a few empty appetizer plates, wiping away a small bead of condensation from the pristine white tablecloth. I made sure every single detail was impeccable, setting the stage for the main event. Once my hands were free, I reached into the hidden silk pocket of my gown. I pulled out a small rectangular gift box, wrapped in deep navy velvet and tied with a flawless gold ribbon. It was an unassuming package, completely dwarfed by the massive, towering floral arrangements and the multi-tiered wedding cake nearby. But that small box was the heaviest thing in the entire room. I reached over and placed the gorgeous wedding gift box directly in the dead center of the table. I positioned it perfectly right in front of Julian's seat, making absolutely sure it was the very first thing he would see when he sat down for the toasts. I smoothed my fingers over the cream-colored card tucked neatly under the gold ribbon, ensuring the embossed letters of my company name were facing upward, waiting to be read. I offered the table one last chillingly polite smile. I stepped backward, my heels making no sound on the floor, and retreated into the dimly lit periphery of the grand hall. I moved toward the massive marble pillars near the exit, folding myself entirely into the shadows. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. I could see Beatrice still fawning over Julian's mother. I could see Chloe posing arrogantly for the wedding photographers. I could see Marcus nervously checking his expensive watch, drinking his bourbon entirely too fast. I crossed my arms over my chest and leaned my shoulder against the cool stone pillar. The jazz band picked up the tempo, the room buzzing with ignorant, arrogant bliss. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power coursing through my veins. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. I just needed to wait. The detonator was resting beautifully on the center table, and it was only a matter of time before someone struck the match. To truly appreciate the absolute devastation about to unfold in that ballroom, you have to rewind exactly 3 hours. The air inside the sprawling bridal suite of the Grand Oak was thick and suffocating, heavy with the cloying scent of imported lilies, aerosol hairspray, and the frantic, nervous energy of people desperate to impress. I was tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the expansive dressing room, sitting quietly before an antique mahogany vanity. The mirror reflected the chaotic whirlwind behind me. Chloe was shrieking at a makeup artist about the exact shade of her blush, while her bridesmaids fluttered around her like anxious birds. I kept my eyes fixed forward, trying to remain an invisible observer in a room that clearly did not want me there. My focus was suddenly drawn to the large, looming shadow that appeared in the mirror, blocking the doorway behind me. Marcus. He stepped directly into my line of sight, his broad shoulders boxing me into the narrow, claustrophobic space between the vanity and the floral wallpaper. Looking past my own shoulder into the glass, I watched his face contort into a mask of deep, unyielding disapproval. He stared intensely at the flawless, cascading diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. It was a spectacular vintage piece I had purchased for myself after closing a massive commercial real estate acquisition, a private, quiet celebration of my own relentless hard work. Marcus hated it. He hated the necklace, and he hated anything that reminded him of my financial independence. "Take it off," Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the bridal party across the room would not hear. "Mom says do not outshine Chloe. Julian comes from an old money lineage. Please act educated and do not bring your ghetto-flaunting habits in here." The insult was surgically designed to break me, to remind me of the working-class neighborhood I grew up in, to make me feel small, unrefined, and entirely unworthy of the opulent space we were standing in. Years ago, early in our marriage, a comment like that from my husband would have sent me fleeing to the bathroom in tears of shame. Today it barely registered as a nuisance. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a single crack in my composure. I simply held his panicked, angry gaze in the mirror. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up to the nape of my neck and unclasped the heavy jewelry. I let the diamonds slide from my skin, tossing them coldly onto the hard marble surface of the vanity. The expensive gems hit the stone with a sharp, heavy clack that made Marcus physically flinch. I turned my head just enough to look at him directly over my shoulder, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. "Are you afraid I will outshine your sister? Or are you afraid Julian's family will find out? The suit you are wearing was swiped on my credit card?" Marcus froze completely. The arrogant, condescending sneer vanished from his face, instantly replaced by the terrifying realization that I was no longer playing his obedient, submissive game. The tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit he was parading around, in the exact suit his mother had been loudly bragging about to the wedding planners all morning, was funded entirely by my Black American Express card. His jaw clenched so tightly I could actually see the muscle twitching under his skin. He glanced frantically over his shoulder to ensure Chloe and her gossiping bridesmaids had not heard my remark. His fragile masculinity was entirely dependent on the illusion of his own massive success. He leaned in closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me back into silent submission. "Keep your voice down," he spat his breath hot against my neck. "You have no idea how much pressure my family is under today. This wedding is the most important event in my mother's entire life. Julian's parents are scrutinizing everything we do. If you ruin this for us by acting like some bitter, resentful outsider, I swear to God, Nia, I will never forgive you." I looked at the man I had married. I looked at the perfect tailored seams of his jacket, the ridiculously expensive watch on his wrist, the polished Italian leather shoes on his feet. Every single inch of his outward success was subsidized by my bank accounts. He was a man who loved to play the role of the wealthy, educated elite, bragging about his prestigious university degree, while I quietly worked 80-hour weeks to keep his lifestyle afloat. Yet here he was, treating me like a toxic liability. He was so terrified that his wealthy white in-laws would judge his family that he was willing to completely trample his own wife just to secure his mother's shallow approval. It was pathetic. It was an absolute tragedy of a man. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, vibrating panic. I simply picked up my lip gloss from the vanity and uncapped it, applying it with a steady, incredibly relaxed hand. "Your family's pressure is entirely self-inflicted, Marcus," I said, pressing my lips together. "You are all bending over backwards, suffocating yourselves to impress a family that barely acknowledges your existence. But do not worry. I took off the diamonds. I will blend into the background. I will play the exact quiet part you and your mother want me to play today." Marcus let out a sharp, dismissive breath, clearly mistaking my cold calmness for surrender. He actually thought he had won. He thought his cruel little speech about acting educated had effectively put the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks back in her proper place. He adjusted his stolen silk tie, smoothed the lapels of his stolen suit, and turned his back on me to rejoin the loud, opulent chaos of the bridal suite. He walked away feeling like an absolute king, completely unaware that he had just handed the executioner his own head on a silver platter. I watched him walk away in the mirror. My reflection was perfectly still, my eyes cold sharp, and utterly devoid of mercy. The diamonds sat discarded and ignored on the marble counter, but I did not need them to shine today. I did not need to wear my wealth around my neck to prove my worth. I had something far more brilliant, far more devastating waiting in the wings. I picked up my clutch and stood from the vanity, adjusting the dark fabric of my dress. The true tragedy was not that Marcus was ashamed of me. The true tragedy was that he was too blind to realize that the ground he was standing on, the very walls of this historic mansion, his family was using to project their fake wealth, belonged entirely to the woman he had just insulted. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite flew open, slamming violently against the brass doorstop with a sharp, echoing crack. The sudden noise shattered the quiet, tense isolation of my corner in the dressing room. Beatrice stormed in. The air in the room instantly turned toxic, vibrating with her frantic, erratic energy. She moved like a woman on the verge of a total psychological collapse. Her breathing shallow and ragged, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate kind of social climbing terror. She was clutching a heavy gold-embossed leather seating chart against her chest like a shield. Her knuckles were white from the force of her grip. As she marched toward me, her heels aggressively stabbing the plush carpet, I could see the heavy layers of setting spray struggling to hold her makeup together over the beads of nervous sweat forming on her forehead. She spotted me sitting calmly at the vanity and lunged forward. Before I could even register her movement, her manicured claws snatched the spare paper itinerary right out of my hands. She crumpled the edges of the thick parchment in her desperate, shaking fists, her chest heaving under the stiff emerald silk of her designer gown. "What is the meaning of this?" She shrieked, her voice a harsh, grating whisper designed to stay hidden from the bridesmaids across the room. She slammed the leather seating chart down onto the marble vanity right next to my discarded diamonds. She pointed a shaking ring-adorned finger violently at the floor plan. "Tables 4 and 5, right next to the main dance floor, right next to the Sterling family. You put your people there. You actually had the absolute audacity to seat those loud, unrefined relatives of yours in the prime viewing section of this ballroom." I looked up at her, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of the panic she was trying to inflict upon me. "My mother's sisters and my cousins traveled 6 hours by car to be here today to celebrate your daughter. Tables 4 and 5 are the designated extended family tables. That is exactly where they belong." Belong! Beatrice spat the word out like it was literal poison on her tongue. "They do not belong within 50 miles of the Grand Oak. This is a high society wedding, Nia. Julian's parents have flown in state senators, hedge fund managers, and commercial real estate tycoons from Boston and New York. This family cannot be seen associating with the lower class." I let the heavy, suffocating silence hang between us for a long moment. I pictured my Aunt Vivian, a woman who worked 2 grueling nursing shifts at the city hospital just to afford her modest dress for tonight. I pictured my Uncle Jerome, a retired firefighter, who spent all morning proudly polishing his only good suit just to walk into this mansion to support my husband's family. And here was Beatrice, a woman secretly drowning in millions of dollars of hidden toxic debt, calling my honest, hard-working family the lower class. The absolute staggering delusion of this woman was almost fascinating to witness. It took every ounce of my highly trained corporate self-control not to reach across the marble vanity and slap the arrogance right off her face. "So where did you move them?" I asked quietly, keeping my hands resting smoothly in my lap. "To the back terrace, near the kitchen doors." Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless laugh, her eyes completely wild with manic pride. "Move them. I did not move them anywhere. I had the estate security detail turn their vehicles around at the main gate. I told the armed guards to inform them that there was a catastrophic printing error with the invitations, that we were entirely over capacity, and that there simply were no more seats available for them inside this property." The temperature in the small corner of the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. My heart pounded a slow, steady, lethal rhythm against my ribs. "You turned my family away at the gate." I stated the words tasting like dry ash in my mouth. "I did what had to be done to protect our reputation," she snapped, pacing the narrow space between the velvet chaise and my chair like a caged animal. "Julian's father has a group of extremely important commercial real estate investors who decided to attend at the very last minute. We needed 2 premium tables to accommodate them immediately. I am not going to shove white billionaires into a dark corner just so your Aunt Vivian can sit under a crystal chandelier and complain about her arthritis." She stopped pacing and leaned in close, her face mere inches from mine. The desperate, sour scent of her panic was overwhelming. "You need to understand the stakes of today, Nia. We are merging with the Sterlings. We are cementing our legacy in this city. We are proving that we are the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. I will not let your ghetto roots drag us down into the mud. You should be thanking me right now. I saved you the terrible embarrassment of having your uncultured relatives use the wrong forks in front of people who actually matter." I watched her manic episode unfold with cold clinical fascination. This was what generational trauma and deeply internalized racism looked like when wrapped in designer labels and fake pearls. Beatrice was so profoundly ashamed of her own background, so utterly terrified of not being accepted by the wealthy white elite that she was willing to inflict profound, unforgivable cruelty on her own people just to secure a seat at a table that did not even want her. She was a pathetic, hollow creature entirely consumed by the disease of vanity. "They drove a very long way, Beatrice," I said softly, offering her one final microscopic chance to show a shred of basic human empathy. "My uncle brought a handmade gift for Chloe. He spent weeks carving it. You could have at least let them drive up to the valet and drop it off. You could have shown them a fraction of basic human decency." Beatrice scoffed loudly, waving her hand with absolute disdain. "Oh, please. We do not need whatever cheap handmade trinket he cobbled together in his dusty garage. Chloe is registering for baccarat crystal and imported silver. Your family's presence here today would have been a glaring, ugly stain on an otherwise flawless aesthetic. I did what a matriarch is supposed to do. I protected the bloodline. The bloodline," I repeated the word dripping with quiet, concentrated venom. "Yes, the bloodline," she snapped back, crossing her arms defensively. "And if you had any actual respect for your husband, you would support my decision." Marcus agreed with me completely, by the way. He was the one who personally handed their names to the security guards this morning. He knows that sacrifices must be made for the greater good of this family. The ultimate betrayal settled deep into my bones, instantly freezing whatever remaining empathy I had left into solid, unbreakable ice. Marcus knew. My husband actually handed the list to the security guards. The man who sat in my Aunt Vivian's living room at Thanksgiving eating the food she cooked with her own hands threw her out like garbage just to appease his monstrous mother. I slowly rose from the vanity stool. The sheer terrifying force of my calm demeanor made Beatrice take an involuntary step backward. She expected me to scream. She expected me to cry and beg her to let my family inside. She wanted a loud, dramatic altercation that she could later use to prove to her friends how unhinged and classless her daughter-in-law truly was. But I denied her that satisfaction. I denied her everything. Instead, I reached down and smoothed the invisible wrinkles from the skirt of my dark gown. I looked down at her. She may have been older and she may have been wearing expensive silk, but in this moment, she had never looked smaller, uglier, or more insignificant to me. She turned my blood relatives away. She humiliated my family at the gates of a property that I secretly owned. She threw my loved ones out into the street to make room for wealthy white investors to eat food that I was secretly financing. "You turned them away," I stated one final time, locking the undeniable fact into the permanent record of my mind. "I did," she declared, lifting her chin in a pathetic, trembling display of fake royalty. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat. Now fix your face, go out to that ballroom and try to make yourself useful. Do not speak unless spoken to, and for the love of God, stay away from the Sterling family." I stood up, slowly, deliberately. I let the heavy silence stretch, expanding until it consumed every inch of oxygen in that suffocating bridal suite. I rose to my full height, straightening my spine, forcing Beatrice to tilt her chin upward just to maintain eye contact. From this angle, looking down at her frantic, heavily contoured face, the power dynamic in the room shifted with the force of a tectonic plate snapping into place. The terrified, desperate woman standing before me was no longer a towering, untouchable matriarch. She was just a delinquent tenant who was drastically behind on her rent. I kept my voice impeccably level, stripping it of any emotion, any hurt, any anger. I delivered the words with the smooth, clinical precision of a corporate shark closing a hostile acquisition. "Are you sure you want to kick guests out of the Grand Oak?" I asked, tilting my head just a fraction. "The management here is very strict about altering the guest list." Beatrice let out a harsh, barking scoff. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of absolute arrogance. She ran her hands down the front of her stiff emerald silk gown, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, trying to literally brush off my warning. She puffed out her chest, channeling generations of fabricated superiority. "This mansion is our family's legacy," Beatrice sneered, her voice dripping with venom and unearned pride. "I will do whatever I want." A soft, barely audible chuckle escaped my lips. It was a genuine sound of amusement slipping out before I could contain it. Beatrice's eyes narrowed entirely, misinterpreting my laughter as a nervous defense mechanism. She thought I was cracking under her pressure. She thought she had finally broken my spirit and put the poor, uncultured girl back in her miserable place. But she was wrong. She was so catastrophically wrong. My inner monologue roared to life, a symphony of cold, hard facts that would soon level her entire world. Family legacy. The phrase echoed in my mind, ringing with absolute hilarity. Beatrice was standing in the middle of a massive historic estate, claiming blood right to the crown molding, and the imported marble floors completely oblivious to the reality of her own financial ruin. This mansion was foreclosed on 6 months ago. The bank stripped it from their prestigious family name after Marcus and his father defaulted on 3 separate massive commercial loans. They had mortgaged their precious legacy to the absolute hilt to fund their lavish lifestyle, their country club memberships, and their desperate need to appear wealthy to the outside world. When the bank finally came knocking to collect the millions they owed, Beatrice had scrambled, begging for extensions, lying to her friends, keeping the foreclosure a deeply guarded, humiliating secret. What Beatrice did not know, what Marcus had absolutely no idea about, was that the bank did not just absorb the property. They auctioned off the toxic debt, and the anonymous, ruthless new owner who swept in and bought the entire estate through a highly classified shell corporation was none other than me. I bought the Grand Oak. I bought the manicured gardens, the sweeping grand staircases, the crystal chandeliers, and the very ground Beatrice was currently digging her designer heels into. I held the deed in a secure vault under the name of my primary holding company, Apex Investment and Wealth Management Group. I was the management she was so blindly defying. I was the ultimate authority in this house. The absolute irony of the situation was intoxicating. Beatrice had just kicked my hardworking blood relatives out of a property that I legally owned, using my own security detail to do it. She had thrown my family out into the street to make room for wealthy white billionaires to eat a luxurious catered dinner that I was secretly financing. She had handed the guest list to my husband, who was too much of a coward to realize he was acting as a bouncer at his own wife's estate. They thought they were the masters of the universe. They thought they were the ultimate gatekeepers of Atlanta's high society. But they were just squatters living on borrowed time, dancing in a ballroom that belonged to the woman they treated like trash. I looked at Beatrice, really looked at her. I saw the desperate hollow core of her existence. She was willing to destroy her own son's marriage, humiliate her own daughter-in-law, and banish fellow black people from her sight, just to secure a fleeting nod of approval from Julian's aristocratic white mother. She was selling her soul for a seat at a table that I could buy and sell 10 times over before breakfast. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry or throw a tantrum. True power does not need to raise its voice. True power simply waits for the perfect moment to strike. As you wish, Beatrice, I said softly, my tone completely devoid of the submission she craved. It is your legacy. Do whatever you want. I turned away from her, my movements fluid and unbothered. I walked over to the marble vanity, leaving my discarded diamond necklace resting exactly where I had dropped it. I did not need to wear my wealth to prove my worth. The diamonds were just stones. The real asset was the brilliant, calculating mind that had acquired them. I picked up my sleek clutch, my fingers grazing the smooth leather, feeling the satisfying weight of the documents hidden safely inside. The final nail in their collective coffin. Beatrice scoffed behind me, victorious in her own delusion. Just make sure you stay out of the way, she snapped one last time, turning her back to me to bark an order at a passing bridesmaid. I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite, my heels gliding silently across the plush carpet. With every step I took, I shed the persona of the submissive, accommodating wife. I shed the guilt of hiding my massive success. I shed the lingering hope that this family would ever treat me with basic human decency. They had drawn the battle lines clearly and irrevocably. They had turned my family away at the gates. They had chosen their side. Now I was going to show them exactly what happens when you wage war against a woman who holds all the keys to your kingdom. I pulled open the heavy door and stepped out into the grand hallway of my own mansion. The music from the ballroom drifted up the sweeping marble staircase, a lively jazz tune that felt like the perfect soundtrack for a highly orchestrated demolition. Below me, the catering staff moved efficiently, carrying trays of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres. They wore crisp, white uniforms provided by the premium hospitality group that I had acquired 3 years ago. Every single person working this wedding, from the security guards at the gate to the chef in the kitchen, ultimately reported to my payroll. I walked down the staircase, trailing my hand lightly along the polished mahogany banister. I admired the craftsmanship of my property. I admired the high ceilings and the massive portraits of Beatrice's ancestors lining the walls. Soon those portraits would be boxed up and shipped to a storage unit, making way for whatever I decided to do with the space. Perhaps I would turn this estate into a corporate retreat for my top executives. Perhaps I would raze it to the ground and build luxury condominiums. The choice was entirely mine. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the wedding reception washed over me. I saw Julian's family mingling near the center of the room, their posture stiff and expectant. I saw Chloe posing for the cameras, her fake smile plastered across her face. And I saw Marcus nervously nursing his bourbon, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to collapse. Beatrice wanted me to be a server. She wanted me to play the role of the uneducated, invisible help. She wanted to strip me of my dignity and parade me in front of her new wealthy in-laws as a cautionary tale of bad breeding. I smiled, a sharp, dangerous curve of my lips. If she wanted a server, I would serve. I would serve them the most devastating, humiliating reality check in the history of Atlanta high society. I would serve them their eviction notices, their foreclosure documents, and their divorce papers, all wrapped up in a beautiful velvet gift box. I stepped into the grand ballroom, letting the shadows embrace me. I was no longer Nia, the disappointing wife from the wrong side of the tracks. I was the architect of their ruin, and the show was finally ready to begin. The grand oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a heavy, dramatic thud, and the string quartet shifted seamlessly into a sweeping classical bridal march. Every guest in the opulent ballroom rose to their feet in unison. The collective intake of breath was audible over the music as Chloe stepped into the golden, buttery light of the room. She was a vision of fabricated perfection. She wore a custom gown that cost more than her new husband's annual salary, a sprawling, excessive masterpiece of imported French lace and hand-sewn pearls. She glided down the aisle with the practiced, haughty grace of a woman who genuinely believed she was royalty. Julian stood at the altar, looking entirely captivated by the illusion she had so carefully crafted. He saw a wealthy, highly educated heiress walking toward him. He saw the absolute pinnacle of high society elegance. He did not see the eviction notices, the maxed-out credit cards, or the desperate, clawing panic that kept her family awake at night. If you were to look at that glittering room, your eyes would naturally follow the radiant bride blinded by the flashing cameras and the weeping relatives. But if your perspective were to shift, gliding horizontally past the towering floral centerpieces and the rows of mesmerized wealthy guests, your gaze would eventually land on a dark, forgotten corner near the service doors. There I stood perfectly still, holding a heavy silver water pitcher wrapped in a crisp white linen cloth. I was the ghost at the feast. I watched the golden child of this fraudulent dynasty claim her prize, entirely unaware that she was walking down an aisle built on a foundation of my money. The vows were exchanged. The polite applause thundered through the cavernous space, and the delicate transition from a sacred ceremony to an opulent, excessive reception began. The catering staff moved like a well-oiled machine, carrying massive silver trays of caviar, truffle-infused appetizers, and premium vintage champagne. I moved seamlessly among them, blending perfectly into the machinery of the event. I was a phantom dressed in high fashion, hiding in plain sight. Beatrice was in her absolute element. The reception was her ultimate battlefield, and she was waging a war for social supremacy. She floated from table to table, her stiff emerald silk gown rustling aggressively as she targeted Julian's most prominent family members. I found myself assigned to the primary VIP section, which meant I had a front row seat to the most pathetic, desperate performance of social climbing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I stepped forward to refill a crystal water goblet just as Beatrice leaned in to charm Julian's uncle, a man who owned a fleet of shipping vessels in Boston and reeked of old money arrogance. Beatrice placed a manicured hand to her chest, laughing a bright artificial laugh that made my teeth ache. "Oh, Marcus is simply too humble to talk about it himself." Beatrice projected her voice loudly, ensuring everyone at the table could hear her boast. "But he is doing absolutely brilliantly. He just officially took over as the director of our family investment fund. The portfolio is massive, of course, but he handles the pressure of the market with such incredible grace." I poured the iced water into the uncle's glass in a steady, unbroken stream, my face a mask of absolute stone. The family investment fund. The sheer staggering audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking to witness up close. Marcus did not have an investment fund. Marcus had a deeply negative credit score, a car facing imminent repossession, and a mountain of overdue gambling debts. His entire financial portfolio consisted of the allowance I deposited into his checking account every single month just to keep the loan sharks away from our front door. Yet here he was, sitting 2 chairs down, nodding with a tight, nervous smile as his mother painted him as a Wall Street prodigy. Beatrice did not stop there. She gestured grandly toward the center dance floor where Chloe was swaying gently with Julian under a massive crystal chandelier. And our sweet Chloe Beatrice continued, actually wiping a fake theatrical tear from the corner of her eye. She is the sole heiress to the estate. We wanted to make sure she had the perfect historic venue for her special day. The Grand Oak has been the jewel of our family for so long, and it is just wonderful to share our legacy with Julian's lovely family. I stepped back, wrapping the crisp white linen napkin around the base of my water pitcher to catch a stray bead of condensation. The estate she was currently gifting to her daughter, verbally the very building she was claiming as her ancestral legacy, was the exact same estate my holding company had purchased out of foreclosure just weeks ago. She was giving away a kingdom that she had already lost. But Beatrice needed to solidify her dominance. She needed to prove to these wealthy white aristocrats that she belonged at their table, that she possessed the same casual cruelty and command over the working class that they did. She needed a prop to elevate her own status, and I was standing right within her reach. She turned her sharp, calculating eyes away from the wealthy uncle and locked them directly onto me. Her expression instantly hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She snapped her fingers in my direction. The sharp cracking sound cut rudely through the polite dinner conversation. "You there," Beatrice barked, pointing a rigid, heavily jeweled finger at the edge of the table. "Pour more water for the gentleman immediately. And wipe this condensation off the table. Heavens, why are the catering staff so incredibly slow today? Do we have to teach you how to do basic tasks?" The table fell dead silent. Julian's relatives stopped eating and watched the interaction with mild, detached curiosity. They were accustomed to treating service workers poorly, so Beatrice's outburst did not offend them, it merely entertained them. Marcus kept his eyes glued to his plate of truffle risotto. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped his heavy silver fork. He would not look at me. He absolutely refused to defend his wife. He sat there in his stolen suit and let his mother treat the woman who paid for his very existence like a stray dog that had wandered into the dining room off the street. I did not hesitate. I did not glare at her or offer a sharp retort. I stepped forward, bowing my head slightly in a gesture of flawless, fabricated submission. I poured the ice water into the glass. I took a fresh, dry linen cloth from my apron and meticulously wiped the invisible beads of moisture from the polished wooden table right in front of Beatrice's plate. I moved with the silent, highly efficient grace of a true professional. Every degrading command she issued, every sharp, insulting reprimand she threw at me regarding my speed or my intelligence, I absorbed with total, terrifying calm. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an exhilarating, intoxicating rush of absolute power. Beatrice actually thought she was putting me in my place. She thought she was elevating her own social status by stepping on my neck in front of the people she worshipped. She did not realize that every single time she snapped her fingers at me, every time she called me slow or uneducated, she was just digging her own grave a few feet deeper. She was dining on my fine china, she was drinking my expensive wine, she was breathing the climate-controlled air inside my house. Let her play the queen for a few more hours. Let her bask in the glorious fake light of her non-existent empire. The higher she climbed on her fragile mountain of lies, the more bones she was going to break when I finally kicked the ladder out from under her. I finished wiping the table, gave a polite subservient nod to the table of frauds, and slipped seamlessly back into the shadows to retrieve another bottle of vintage wine. The golden child's charade was proceeding perfectly, and my patience was infinite. I navigated the labyrinth of the catering kitchen, a stark stainless steel contrast to the gold dripping from the ballroom ceilings. I selected a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux from the private reserve. My reserve. I draped a fresh, crisp linen napkin over my forearm and stepped back out into the glittering battlefield. The jazz band had shifted into a slow, sultry melody, the kind of music designed to make wealthy people feel even more important than they already did. I moved toward the grand head table, my face an impenetrable mask of professional servitude. If there had been a camera capturing this exact moment, it would have zoomed in tight on my hands. My knuckles were stark white, gripping the edge of the heavy silver serving tray with a force that could have bent the metal. My fingernails dug into the polished surface, a silent, violent physical manifestation of the absolute rage boiling just beneath my skin. But I forced my fingers to relax, uncurling them one by one, replacing the visceral tension with the fluid, practiced grace of a phantom. I approached the VIP table from the blind side, stepping into the peripheral vision of Julian's mother, just as she leaned forward to deliver her ultimate verdict on my family. Mrs. Sterling held her crystal champagne flute with a lazy, entitled elegance. She was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, a woman whose entire existence was insulated by generational wealth and historical privilege. She looked across the table at Beatrice, her gaze sharp and evaluating. I must confess, Beatrice Mrs. Sterling began, her cultured, quiet voice, easily slicing through the ambient noise of the ballroom. I had my initial reservations about this union. You understand, of course. When two vastly different worlds collide, one must be careful about maintaining certain standards. Beatrice leaned in so far across the table she nearly knocked over a silver candlestick. Her eyes were wide, desperate, hanging on to every single syllable that dropped from the older white woman's lips. I understand completely, Mrs. Sterling. Beatrice cooed, her voice trembling with an eager, pathetic kind of desperation. We hold ourselves to the exact same rigorous standards. Mrs. Sterling offered a thin, approving smile. But I must say you have entirely exceeded my expectations. Your family is so remarkably civilized, so incredibly classy. She paused, taking a slow sip of her champagne. Then she raised a hand draped in antique diamonds and waved it lazily in my direction, not looking at my face, just gesturing at my body like I was an unpleasant piece of furniture. It is so refreshing. Mrs. Sterling continued, her tone dripping with casual, insidious poison. You are absolutely nothing like those uneducated servers out there. One can always tell when someone lacks proper breeding and education. They just carry this heavy, sluggish energy of the lower class. Do you not agree? The racial and classist undertones of the conversation were not even hidden. They were paraded right out in the open, dressed up as a polite high society compliment. Mrs. Sterling was drawing a clear, violent line between the acceptable black people sitting at the table and the unacceptable black woman standing behind them pouring their drinks. It was a textbook microaggression, a subtle but deeply violent erasure of my humanity, designed to test just how far Beatrice was willing to go to fit in. Beatrice did not just agree, she practically leaped over the table to validate the insult. Oh, absolutely, Mrs. Sterling. Beatrice laughed, a high-pitched, sycophantic sound that made my stomach churn. It is all about how one is raised. We believe in absolute excellence in this family. We simply do not associate with that kind of element. You have to separate yourself from the uncultured masses to truly thrive. I stood frozen in time, the bottle of vintage Bordeaux suddenly feeling as heavy as a cinder block in my hands. The sheer staggering sickness of Beatrice's social climbing was on full display. She was so profoundly desperate for white validation, so utterly terrified of being associated with the working-class black community she had clawed her way out of, that she was eagerly throwing her own daughter-in-law under the bus. She was proudly performing the role of the exceptional minority trampling on my dignity to earn a fleeting, meaningless nod of approval from a woman who would never truly see her as an equal. But the ultimate betrayal, the knife that twisted deepest into my back, did not come from Beatrice. It came from the man sitting directly across from her. Marcus let out a deep, booming chuckle. He leaned back in his plush velvet chair, adjusting the cuffs of the suit I had paid for, and nodded in vigorous agreement with the white billionaire who had just called his wife an uneducated low-class servant. "You are entirely right, Mrs. Sterling," Marcus added smoothly, picking up his glass of bourbon. "It is a completely different mindset. Some people just do not have the capacity for high society. They belong exactly where they are." He raised his glass in a toast to the insult, taking a long, arrogant sip of his drink. My inner monologue roared to life, a deafening siren of cold, hard reality. He was laughing. My husband was actually laughing. This was not just a failure of a marriage. This was a catastrophic failure of a man. He was sitting at a table funded by my immense hidden wealth, eating food prepared by a hospitality group I owned inside a historic mansion that belonged entirely to me. Yet he was chuckling along with a racist, classist joke aimed directly at my face. He was selling out his own wife, his own blood, his own dignity just to earn a pat on the head from a family that viewed him as an exotic prop. He knew exactly who I was. He knew I held a master's degree, that I had built an empire from the ground up, that I possessed a brilliant, ruthless intellect that had saved him from total financial ruin. But his masculinity was so incredibly fragile, his ego so pathetic and hollow, that he actively enjoyed seeing me humiliated. Demeaning me in public was his pathetic, cowardly way of reclaiming power in his own mind, even though he was essentially a parasite feeding off my success. The violent urge to smash the heavy wine bottle against the polished table surged through my veins. I wanted to shatter the crystal tear down the white orchids and scream the absolute truth until their eardrums bled. But I did not. The cold, terrifying discipline that had made me a billionaire took over, burying the raw emotion under a glacier of pure, calculated strategy. I stepped forward. I did not shake. I did not tremble. I uncorked the vintage Bordeaux with the smooth, silent efficiency of a shadow. I leaned over Mrs. Sterling's shoulder, the scent of her overpowering, expensive floral perfume filling my lungs. I poured the dark ruby liquid into her crystal glass. The pour was absolute terrifying perfection. Not a single drop splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. I moved around the massive table, filling Beatrice's glass next. She did not even look up at me. She was too busy basking in the warm, toxic glow of Mrs. Sterling's approval. Then I moved to Marcus. I stood directly beside him, close enough to smell the bourbon on his breath. I tipped the bottle, letting the dark wine flow into his glass. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked downward. He looked at my hands. He saw my diamond wedding ring still resting securely on my finger, a silent, damning witness to his monumental cowardice. He saw the steady, unyielding grip of my fingers on the bottle. He swallowed hard. The fake, arrogant smile faltered on his lips for just a moment, a sudden flash of profound unease crossing his features. He knew I heard every single word. He knew I had stood there and absorbed his betrayal. But he still said nothing. He simply looked away, choosing his fragile, fake, elite persona over the woman who had saved his life. I stepped back, draping the linen napkin flawlessly over my arm, holding the heavy silver tray against my waist. The anger was entirely gone now. The hurt was completely eradicated, burned away by the searing heat of clarity. All that remained standing in that glittering ballroom was the cold, calculating executioner, patiently waiting for the absolute perfect moment to drop the blade. They had dug their graves, lined them with velvet, and willingly climbed inside. All I had to do now was bury them. The perspective of the room felt violently tilted. Everything was slanted. The massive crystal chandeliers above seemed to hang at a precarious, unnatural angle, threatening to crash down onto the imported marble floors at any given second. The golden light they cast created long, warped shadows that stretched like dark claws across the ballroom. The wealthy guests laughing and sipping their expensive champagne looked like distorted caricatures of human beings. This was the psychological reality of my existence within this family. A completely skewed, off-kilter universe where the ultimate frauds wore the crowns and the actual queen was forced to carry the serving tray. I stood perfectly still near the heavily draped service doors, planting my feet firmly onto the ground, refusing to let their twisted reality knock me off balance. The string quartet had been replaced by a lively 8-piece jazz band that filled the cavernous room with an energetic thumping bass line. It was time for the bride and groom to make their highly anticipated rounds. I watched Chloe emerge from the center of the dance floor. Her hand was clamped around Julian's arm with the desperate vice-like grip of a drowning woman holding onto a life preserver. She was a walking masterpiece of fabricated wealth. The custom gown she wore was a sprawling, excessive mountain of imported French lace and hand-sewn pearls that dragged heavily across the floor. She floated from table to table with a haughty, practiced grace, tilting her chin up to accept the lavish compliments from Julian's old money relatives. Julian smiled down at her with pure, unadulterated adoration. He was a good man, born into a legacy of generational wealth, completely and utterly blind to the monstrous financial deception clinging to his arm. He saw a refined, highly educated heiress who shared his refined tastes. He did not see the terrifying maxed-out credit card bills hidden in her nightstand. He did not see the eviction notices her mother had been frantically shredding for the past 6 months. Most importantly, he did not know that his beautiful bride had literally wept on the floor of my husband's home office, begging her brother to drain my personal bank accounts just to afford the deposit on the very dress she was wearing. They moved through the crowd playing the roles of Atlanta's newest royal couple, clinking glasses and radiating a completely hollow manufactured joy. I watched their progression with cold, clinical detachment. Chloe's eyes darted around the perimeter of the room, scanning the faces of the catering staff. When her gaze finally locked onto my dark, uniform-clad figure standing near the shadows, a chilling, predatory smile stretched across her perfectly contoured face. She tapped Julian's arm, whispering something sweet and undoubtedly false into his ear, and then deliberately steered him away from his wealthy uncles and directly toward my isolated corner. The skewed, uncomfortable energy of the room spiked violently. The floor felt as though it were dropping out from under me, tilting at a maddening angle as she approached. Chloe was not walking over to offer a polite greeting. She was not coming to apologize for Beatrice's horrific racist display at the head table. She was coming over to twist the knife. She needed to savor her fabricated victory and remind the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks exactly who was in charge. As they closed the distance, the heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume invaded my personal space, fighting a toxic battle with the smell of the roasted meats on the nearby buffet line. Julian offered me a polite, completely oblivious nod, clearly assuming I was just another anonymous, nameless member of the event staff assigned to keep their water glasses full. But Chloe stepped closer. She abandoned all pretense of bridal grace. She leaned in her movements, sharp, aggressive, and incredibly fast. From the perspective of the wealthy guests watching from the nearby tables, it looked like a beautiful, touching moment of family inclusion. The radiant bride taking a brief second to warmly embrace the hard-working staff. But the reality was a grotesque, twisted nightmare. Her lips brushed against my ear, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper that completely contradicted the bright, glowing smile plastered across her face. "Thanks for wiring that $50,000 to Marcus's account this morning," she breathed, the words dripping with absolute brazen entitlement. "We really needed the cash for our honeymoon in the Maldives. Do not worry. Marcus will be sure to reward you when you get home." The sheer staggering audacity of her statement hit my chest like a physical blow. My body did not move a single inch. My breathing remained perfectly slow and rhythmic. She was actually bragging. She was standing in a foreclosed mansion wearing a dress funded by my corporate acquisitions and openly bragging about extorting $50,000 from me through her cowardly, spineless brother. Marcus had come to me weeping at 6 o'clock that morning. He had fallen to his knees on our bedroom floor, claiming the money was desperately needed to pay off a violent bookie who was threatening to break his legs and end his life before the wedding ceremony began. He had sworn on his life it was a matter of absolute physical safety. And here was his sister happily and maliciously confessing that they had colluded to steal my hard-earned money just so she could sip expensive cocktails on a private white sand beach in the Indian Ocean. The reward comment was the ultimate sickening insult. She viewed my marriage as a transactional, degrading arrangement, where I paid the massive bills and received meager, pathetic scraps of physical affection in return. I did not pull away from her. I did not gasp or widen my eyes or give her the immense satisfaction of seeing even a fraction of my shock. I simply turned my head a millimeter, bringing my lips perfectly level with her ear. I matched her conspiratorial posture, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm, smooth, and utterly devoid of mercy. "That is not honeymoon money." I whispered my words, slicing through the heavy, perfumed air like a freshly sharpened razor blade. "That is the price of buying back Marcus's last shred of dignity." I felt Chloe's entire body stiffen violently against me. Her grip on Julian's arm tightened with such sudden, frantic force that her manicured nails dug visibly into the fine fabric of his expensive tuxedo jacket. I did not stop. I leaned in just a fraction closer, ensuring every single syllable was permanently burned into the deepest, darkest corners of her brain. "Enjoy tonight, Chloe." I continued my voice, a dark, lethal promise that promised absolute annihilation. "Because tomorrow you will not even have money to buy a cup of coffee." I pulled back smoothly, snapping perfectly into an upright, rigid professional posture. I offered her a bright, flawless, completely hollow smile. The kind of sharp, terrifying smile an executioner gives right before pulling the lever. Chloe's face was a masterpiece of sudden, absolute terror. The smug, triumphant sneer had been completely wiped away, obliterated in a single second. It was replaced by a pale, sickly realization that she had just poked a sleeping dragon with a very short stick. She stared at me, her eyes wide and frantic, her chest heaving, as she desperately searched my calm face for any sign that I was bluffing. She found nothing. She found only a vast, bottomless ocean of cold, hard, unyielding certainty. Julian, completely oblivious to the verbal execution that had just taken place right next to him, gently tugged on Chloe's arm. "Darling, the photographer is ready for us by the grand staircase," he murmured, giving her a loving, entirely ignorant smile. Chloe could barely tear her eyes away from me. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing in panic, and allowed Julian to lead her away. Her graceful, floating stride had completely vanished, replaced by the stiff, jerky, uncoordinated movements of a woman walking directly to her own hanging. I stood alone in the shadows, my heart beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a metronome, counting down to absolute zero. The opening acts were officially over. The racist microaggressions from the head table, the blatant financial theft from my husband, the public humiliation orchestrated by my mother-in-law. They had played every single card in their pathetic, fraudulent deck. Now it was my turn to deal. I turned my attention away from the retreating, terrified bride and focused my gaze entirely on the grand center table. The beautiful navy velvet box sat exactly where I had left it, an unassuming package waiting patiently under the golden glow of the crystal chandelier. The band was gearing up for the final set before the official gift opening ceremony. I smoothed the lapels of my dark uniform, stepped deeper into the comforting embrace of the shadows, and prepared to watch my empire finally fall into place. The vibrant energy of the ballroom began to shift as the evening transitioned into its final, most formal phase. The 8-piece jazz band slowly dialed back their upbeat tempo, letting the lively brass fade into a soft, melodic hum that signaled the guests to return to their seats. The master of ceremonies, a man with a booming theatrical voice, stepped up to the main microphone. He commanded the room's attention, announcing that it was time for the traditional toasts, the cutting of the towering wedding cake, and the opening of the special family gifts placed at the head table. I remained perfectly still in the protective cover of the shadows near the heavy service doors. My breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic. I watched Chloe being led back to the center table by her new husband. Julian held her hand with absolute tenderness, a gentle protective grip that highlighted his complete ignorance of the monster he had just married. Chloe, however, was no longer the radiant floating bride she had been just 10 minutes prior. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders hiked up toward her ears, in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. She walked like a woman stepping barefoot through a minefield, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching the shadows for my face. She collapsed into her plush chair at the head table, her massive lace gown billowing awkwardly around her. The color had entirely drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and hollow under the golden light of the crystal chandeliers. Julian leaned over, whispering something sweet and reassuring into her ear. But Chloe did not even register his words. She was completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that her luxurious fake reality was resting on a foundation of absolute sand, and I was holding the sledgehammer. Julian, ever the charismatic and traditional groom, picked up the main microphone from the center of the table. He stood tall, offering a warm, gracious smile to the hundreds of wealthy guests filling the ballroom. He delivered a flawless, heartfelt speech about love, about the merging of two distinct families, and about the beautiful future he envisioned with his new bride. He thanked his aristocratic parents, acknowledging their generational legacy, and then he turned his attention to Beatrice and Marcus, thanking them for hosting such an incredibly lavish, unforgettable evening at their ancestral estate. Beatrice beamed. She practically vibrated with pride, soaking up the validation from the wealthy white man like a dying plant, absorbing sunlight. She raised her crystal glass of red wine, offering a regal, practiced nod to the crowd completely intoxicated by her own manufactured success. Marcus sat beside her, puffing out his chest in his stolen Tom Ford suit, playing the role of the wealthy, protective older brother to absolute perfection. But as Julian wrapped up his toast, his eyes drifted down to the center of the table. He was looking for the ceremonial cake-cutting knife, but his gaze caught on something else entirely. Sitting right there, nestled intimately between a cascading arrangement of imported white orchids and Julian's own gold-rimmed dinner plate, was the unassuming deep navy velvet box I had placed there earlier. The rich dark fabric seemed to absorb the light from the chandeliers, standing out sharply against the pristine white tablecloth. It did not match the rest of the traditional oversized wedding registry gifts piled on the side tables. It looked corporate, it looked deliberate, it looked expensive. Julian's curiosity was instantly piqued. He was a businessman raised in a world of high-stakes corporate dealings, and he recognized the aesthetic of an executive gift when he saw one. Thinking this was a surprise gesture from one of Marcus's supposed high-level investment partners, Julian reached out across the table. Chloe saw his hand moving toward the velvet box. Her eyes snapped wide open. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand shooting out across the table in a desperate, frantic attempt to stop him. But her reflexes were entirely dulled by panic. She was a fraction of a second too late. Julian's fingers had already brushed the smooth velvet. He gently pulled the small cream-colored card out from beneath the flawless gold ribbon. The ballroom was completely silent save for the soft ambient hum of polite murmurs and the faint clinking of silverware. Every eye in the room was fixed on the groom. Julian brought the thick embossed card up to the light. A slight puzzled frown creased his forehead as he read the words to himself. It clearly did not say what he expected it to say. There was no heartfelt message about a lifetime of love and happiness. There was no sweet familial blessing. There was only a cold, sharp corporate declaration. Assuming this was a highly prestigious formal acknowledgement of Marcus's impressive financial career, Julian decided to incorporate it into his public toast. It was a fatal, irreversible miscalculation born out of pure, wealthy innocence. Julian brought the microphone back up to his mouth. His voice boomed clearly and deeply through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the high ceilings and the marble pillars of the mansion. Before we move on to the cake, Julian announced, his tone bright and appreciative. I want to acknowledge a very special, very official-looking gift sitting right here at the center of our table. It seems Chloe's family has some incredibly generous professional partners celebrating with us tonight. He looked down at the card again, reading the embossed gold lettering aloud for the entire ballroom to hear. With compliments from Apex Investment and Wealth Management Group. The words hung in the air. To 99% of the guests in that room, it was just a name. Just another wealthy corporate entity sending their regards to a prominent family. But to the people sitting at that head table, the name Apex was a lethal injection of pure terror. Julian looked up from the card, his face displaying a mixture of genuine respect and mild confusion. He turned his body slightly, directing his gaze straight toward my mother-in-law. He held the microphone close, ensuring his question was broadcast to every single prominent investor, politician, and socialite in the room. Mother Beatrice Julian asked loudly, his voice echoing into the deafening silence, "Who is Apex? Why did they send a gift?" If you could pinpoint the exact microscopic fraction of a second where a human soul completely leaves the body, I witnessed it right then and there. Beatrice froze. Her entire body locked up instantly, turning to solid stone. The fabricated, arrogant smile she had been wearing all evening was violently ripped from her face. Her eyes bulged, stretching so wide I could see the whites all the way around her pupils. Her meticulously styled hair seemed to tremble as the blood utterly drained from her face, leaving her heavily contoured skin looking like gray, lifeless ash. Apex. She knew that name. She knew it intimately. It was the name printed at the top of the aggressive red-lettered foreclosure notices she had been frantically shoving into her paper shredder for the past 6 months. It was the name of the ruthless, anonymous corporate entity that had completely swallowed her family's toxic debt, stripped them of their ancestral mansion, and relentlessly demanded the millions of dollars they did not have. Apex was the monster hiding under her bed, the absolute nightmare she had been desperately trying to outrun. And now Apex was sitting right in the middle of her daughter's wedding table. The sheer, paralyzing shock short-circuited her brain. Her fingers went completely numb. The muscles in her hands simply gave out. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped through her paralyzed fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the hushed ballroom. The delicate crystal shattered into 1,000 tiny, glittering pieces. The dark ruby-red wine exploded outward, splattering aggressively across the hem of her expensive emerald silk gown and pooling onto the pristine white floor like fresh blood. She did not flinch. She did not look down at the mess. She did not even attempt to apologize for dropping her glass. She just stared blankly at the velvet box, her mouth opening and closing silently, gasping for air that her lungs simply refused to process. Right beside her, the reaction was equally catastrophic. Marcus jolted upward with such sudden violent force that he pushed his heavy wooden chair backward. The chair tipped over, hitting the floor with a loud, aggressive thud that made several guests jump in their seats. Marcus was standing now, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped, panicked animal looking for a fire exit. A thick, heavy layer of sweat immediately broke out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance in seconds. He dragged a trembling hand down his face, smearing his skin, his breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. He knew the name Apex, too. He knew the loan sharks. He knew the bank statements. He knew the absolute crushing weight of the financial ruin that was about to bury him alive. The guests closest to the head table began to murmur. The polite confusion in the room was rapidly morphing into a sharp, uncomfortable tension. Julian lowered the microphone, his own smile fading as he looked back and forth between his terrified new wife, his paralyzed mother-in-law, and his sweating, panicking brother-in-law. The illusion of the flawless, wealthy black elite family had just suffered a massive fatal heart attack right in front of him. I remained pressed against the cool marble pillar in the shadows, my arms crossed over my chest. I watched the glorious, magnificent collapse of their fraudulent empire with absolute, undisturbed serenity. The detonator had been pressed. The blast wave was currently moving through the room, tearing down the wallpaper, shattering the windows, and completely incinerating their fake reality. Beatrice and Marcus were currently burning alive in their own lies, and the match had been struck by the very white man they had sold their souls to impress. The silence stretched on thick, heavy, and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all waiting for someone to explain the unexplainable, waiting for someone to answer the simple question that had just destroyed their lives. It was the perfect exact moment for the architect of this beautiful disaster to finally step into the light. The absolute silence in the ballroom was a living, breathing entity. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum waiting desperately to be filled. The shattered crystal and spilled wine at the head table had already fractured the illusion of the perfect high society wedding, but the true demolition had not even begun. I pushed my shoulder off the cool marble pillar. The comforting protective shadows slid away from my body like water. I took my first deliberate step forward, crossing the invisible boundary between the background and the blinding golden light of the crystal chandeliers. My hands moved smoothly behind my back, my fingers finding the tight utilitarian knot of the crisp white catering apron strapped around my waist. This apron was the ultimate physical manifestation of their disdain. It was the degrading costume Beatrice had forced upon me to erase my dignity, to hide my actual status, and to present me as a cautionary tale of bad breeding to her wealthy white-in-laws. I gripped the thick cotton ties and pulled sharply. The knot surrendered instantly. I pulled the fabric away from my body and let it fall. The heavy white apron crumpled onto the polished hardwood floor with a soft, dismissive thud. Without that degrading shield covering my body, the full, devastating reality of my presence was entirely exposed. The custom haute couture gown I wore was a masterpiece of dark, uncompromising elegance. It caught the ambient light of the ballroom, radiating a quiet, dangerous, and incredibly expensive power. I was no longer the invisible help. I was the executioner stepping onto the scaffold. I began to walk. My heels clicked against the immaculate floor in a slow, steady, rhythmic march that cut through the dead silence of the room. The guests positioned at the tables nearest to the shadows were the first to notice the shift. Their polite, wealthy confusion transformed into blatant, visceral shock as I moved past them. They saw a woman they had completely ignored just minutes prior, suddenly moving with the terrifying, predatory grace of an apex predator. They instinctively pulled their chairs in, shrinking back physically, parting like the Red Sea, to give me a clear, unobstructed path toward the center of the room. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the head table. The sheer terror radiating from my husband's family was a magnificent sight to behold. Beatrice was hyperventilating, her hands clutching the bodice of her ruined wine-stained emerald dress. She was gasping for air, her mouth opening and closing like a fish thrown onto dry land, her eyes tracking my every step with absolute unadulterated horror. Marcus looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his overturned chair. He bumped heavily into a passing waiter, nearly knocking over another tray of drinks, his hands shaking violently at his sides. The cowardly facade of the successful, highly educated financial director had completely vaporized, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling boy who knew exactly what kind of hellfire was marching toward him. Chloe was gripping the edge of the dining table so hard, her knuckles were stark white, her jaw unhinged, her chest heaving as the reality of her impending bankruptcy crashed down upon her. I bypassed the main dance floor entirely, ignoring the sea of staring faces, and headed straight for the secondary stage elevated near the grand windows. The master of ceremonies, a man hired for his booming voice and professional composure, stood near the microphone stand. He watched me ascend the 3 carpeted steps, his mouth hanging slightly open in total professional confusion. He held the wireless microphone loosely in his right hand, unsure if he was supposed to announce me, stop me, or call for security. I did not ask for permission. I did not wait for an introduction. I walked directly up to him, locking my eyes onto his, and reached out. I closed my fingers around the sleek metal handle of the microphone and pulled it firmly from his grip. I moved with such absolute, unquestionable authority that he did not even attempt to resist. He simply let go, took a massive step backward, and yielded the entire floor to me. I stepped into the dead center of the stage. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were locked onto my face. The wealthy real estate investors, the old money aristocrats from Boston, the local politicians, and the social climbing frauds. They were all completely captivated, holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. I looked directly down at the grand head table. I bypassed Beatrice. I bypassed Marcus. I locked my gaze entirely on the groom. "Hi, Julian," I said. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. It was crystal clear, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. There was no shaking, no hesitation, no trace of the bitter, rejected wife. I spoke with the precise clinical articulation of a corporate titan delivering a hostile takeover announcement. "Let me answer that question for your mother-in-law," I continued, letting the words glide effortlessly across the silent room. I watched Julian blink, his handsome face a portrait of complete bewilderment. He looked from me to Beatrice and back to me, desperately trying to connect the dots of a puzzle he did not even know he was playing. Mrs. Sterling, the wealthy white matriarch who had called me uneducated just an hour ago, was sitting bolt upright, her antique diamonds glittering as her jaw tightened in profound confusion. "Apex is the company that just bought out this family's entire $3 million toxic debt," I announced, my voice slicing through the air like a perfectly sharpened guillotine blade. The number hit the room with physical force. $3 million in toxic debt. The wealthy corporate investors sitting at the peripheral tables immediately sat up straighter. The atmosphere shifted from polite confusion to sharp, aggressive business scrutiny. In their world, debt was a dirty word, but toxic debt was an absolute death sentence. They looked at Beatrice and Marcus with sudden predatory disgust, instantly realizing that the lavish historic wealth they had been sold all evening was an elaborate, desperate lie. I paused for just a fraction of a second, letting the financial reality of that statement fully marinate in the minds of the elite crowd. I looked right at Beatrice, watching the last remaining shred of her pride disintegrate into absolute dust. And I said, raising the microphone just a fraction of an inch higher, "The server your mother just ordered to wipe the tables. I am the chief executive officer and chairwoman of Apex." A massive collective gasp of shock erupted from hundreds of guests simultaneously. It was a violent rushing sound, like all the oxygen being instantly sucked out of the ballroom. The polite silence shattered completely. Panicked murmurs filled the room, escalating rapidly into a chaotic, buzzing roar of disbelief. The high society guests leaned across their tables, whispering frantically to one another, pointing at the stage, pointing at Beatrice, pointing at the velvet box still resting in the center of the head table. The illusion of the untouchable elite black family had been publicly executed in less than 30 seconds. Julian's mother, Mrs. Sterling, let out a sharp, highly undignified noise of pure shock. Her hand flew up to her chest, clutching her pearls in a textbook display of aristocratic horror. The woman she had just praised for her impeccable class and breeding had just been exposed as a massive multi-million-dollar fraud by the very woman she had degraded as a lowly servant. The sheer humiliation of being associated with this level of financial ruin painted her pale face a bright, splotchy red. Julian stood frozen at the head table. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked at his new bride, the woman he thought was the sole heiress to a magnificent family fortune. Chloe was trembling violently, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat, completely unable to formulate a single word of defense. The fairy tale wedding she had extorted my money to fund had just transformed into a public catastrophic tribunal. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table so hard the veins in his hands looked ready to burst. He was staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, staggering realization. He finally understood the gravity of his cowardice. He finally understood that while he was busy playing the role of the arrogant big shot to impress a room full of strangers, the woman he had neglected, dismissed, and betrayed had been quietly building a financial empire large enough to swallow his entire bloodline whole. I stood on the stage, the heavy microphone resting securely in my grip, completely unbothered by the frantic buzzing chaos erupting beneath me. I did not break my posture. I did not drop my gaze. I owned the stage. I owned the sound system, and most importantly, I owned the very ground they were standing on. The first blow had been delivered with absolute precision. The financial ruin of their carefully constructed facade was now public knowledge. But I was not finished. The financial devastation was merely the opening act. The true absolute destruction of their lives was waiting patiently inside that deep navy velvet box, and the night was still remarkably young. The revelation hung in the stifling air of the grand ballroom like a physical weight. The words had left my lips and struck the head table with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. I stood on the elevated stage, my posture immaculate, bathed in the warm golden light of the chandeliers. I looked down at the wreckage of my husband's family. A sudden violent whip-pan of reality snapped back and forth between us. On the stage, I was a portrait of absolute unyielding serenity. Down below, Chloe was a masterpiece of total hyperventilating panic. The bride sat frozen in her extravagant imported French lace gown. The dress that was meant to be her crowning glory now looked like a massive, suffocating cage, trapping her to the chair. Her chest heaved erratically. Her perfectly manicured hands shook with such violent tremors that her heavy diamond engagement ring clattered loudly against the crystal water goblet beside her plate. She looked at me, then looked at Julian, her eyes wide and wild with the frantic, cornered terror of a woman who knew her execution was inescapable. Julian stood absolutely rigid. The pristine, charismatic smile he had worn all evening was completely eradicated. His aristocratic old money upbringing had trained him to handle high-stakes corporate mergers and boardroom disputes, but nothing could have prepared him for the staggering magnitude of the fraud currently sitting next to him. His sharp mind rapidly processed the information I had just broadcast to the entire room. Apex Investment and Wealth Management Group, $3 million in toxic debt. He looked at the velvet box on the table, then slowly, deliberately turned his head to look at his new wife. The betrayal washing over Julian's face was profound. He did not look angry at first. He looked genuinely, fundamentally horrified. He had bought into the elaborate fantasy Beatrice and Chloe had sold him. He believed he was marrying into a proud, historic lineage of successful Black entrepreneurs who shared his family's values of legacy and financial preservation. He had defended Chloe to his skeptical mother. He had stood by this family. Julian stared at Chloe. His voice when he finally spoke was low, vibrating with a dangerous, barely contained fury that carried perfectly over the hushed, breathless whispers of the ballroom guests. "You told me your family owned this estate," Julian said. The accusation struck Chloe like a physical blow. She flinched, shrinking back into her plush chair. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. She desperately reached out her trembling fingers, grasping at the sleeve of Julian's tailored tuxedo jacket. "Julian, please!" Chloe stammered her voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine that sounded absolutely nothing like the arrogant heiress from 10 minutes ago. "It is a misunderstanding. She is lying. Nia is just angry. She is Marcus's wife, and she is just trying to ruin my special day because she is jealous. Please, darling, you have to listen to me." Julian did not soften. He did not reach back to hold her hand. He looked down at her grasping fingers with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He stepped back, physically, pulling his arm away from her touch, as if her lace glove were soaked in poison. The absolute disgust in his eyes was the final fatal strike to Chloe's fabricated reality. She let out a sharp, pathetic sob, covering her mouth with both hands, as the tears she had faked so many times before finally fell for real, ruining her immaculate bridal makeup. Before Julian could demand another answer, I raised my hand and firmly tapped the head of the microphone. The sharp, percussive thud echoed through the massive speakers, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room. The frantic whispering among the wealthy guests ceased immediately. Hundreds of faces turned back up to the stage, completely captivated by the unfolding slaughter. "Open the box, Julian," I commanded. My voice was smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of mercy. Julian did not hesitate. He completely ignored the frantic, tearful begging coming from his bride. He turned his back on Chloe, stepped forward to the center of the head table, and reached for the deep navy velvet box. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless sound of sheer terror, but she was far too paralyzed by shock to physically stop him. Marcus remained slumped in his chair, his head buried in his hands, completely surrendering to the devastating reality of his own ruin. Julian grabbed the flawless gold ribbon and ripped it apart. He tore the velvet lid off the box and tossed it carelessly onto the pristine white tablecloth. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of official legal documents bound by a stark red clip. He flipped open the first page. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched his pupils dilate as he registered the bold, aggressive red stamps marking the top of the paperwork. I watched the last remaining shred of his belief in this family disintegrate into absolute dust. Inside that box are the official bank receipts and the final court orders I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the expansive ballroom where the elite investors and politicians sat listening in stunned silence. The documents you are holding, Julian, prove that the Grand Oak was officially foreclosed on last month. The bank seized this property after Marcus and his father completely defaulted on multiple massive commercial loans. They stripped this estate from their family name. The historic legacy your mother-in-law has been boasting about all evening is a total fabricated lie. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of guests. The old money aristocrats from Boston exchanged horrified, deeply offended glances. In their world, losing money was a quiet misfortune. But faking generational wealth, throwing a massive fraudulent gala in a foreclosed property you no longer owned, was the ultimate, unforgivable social crime. It was the height of tacky, desperate, grotesque behavior. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, locking my gaze onto Mrs. Sterling. The wealthy white matriarch, who had so casually called me an uneducated servant, was currently clutching her chest, looking like she might actually faint from the sheer overwhelming humiliation of being associated with this catastrophic scam. But I am not finished. I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly conversational calm. Because an eviction notice is only the beginning of the truth. I gestured broadly to the magnificent spread of food resting on the tables across the room. I pointed to the towering multi-tiered wedding cake, the imported floral centerpieces, and the crystal glasses filled with vintage wine. The lobster and truffle dinner your family is eating right now hasn't been paid for, I stated. The guests instinctively looked down at their gold-rimmed plates. Several prominent businessmen actually pushed their forks away, suddenly disgusted by the extravagant meal they had been enjoying. The taste of the rich, decadent food instantly turned to ash in their mouths. Beatrice has spent the entire past year bragging about the limitless budget of this wedding. I projected, my voice making sure it pierced right through the heart of her social climbing vanity. But the reality is that the credit cards used to secure this catering company bounced 3 weeks ago. The floral arrangements, the live jazz band, the imported silk tablecloths, none of it was financed by the fake wealth of the family sitting at that head table. They are entirely bankrupt. I paused, letting the crushing weight of their financial destitution settle heavily over the crowded room. I watched Chloe bury her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed into her wedding gown. I watched Marcus refuse to look up, an absolute coward, to the bitter, spectacular end. As the new owner of this estate, I declared driving the final lethal stake directly into the heart of their empire. And as the primary shareholder of the premier hospitality group currently serving you tonight, I allowed this wedding to proceed under my roof, using my staff and eating my food simply because I wanted every single person in this room to witness exactly who these people really are. The revelation was absolute devastation. I had not just bought their house. I owned the very infrastructure of their celebration. I owned the hands that poured their wine. I owned the lights shining down on their faces. I had surrounded them with my power, wrapping them in a beautiful, luxurious web of my own making, and they had been far too arrogant to even notice the silk threads tightening around their throats. Julian threw the stack of foreclosure documents onto the table. The heavy papers landed squarely on top of Beatrice's spilled ruby red wine, soaking up the dark liquid like a sponge. He looked at Beatrice, who was still staring blankly at the shattered crystal on the floor, completely broken. He looked at Marcus, the supposed financial prodigy who was currently crying silently into his hands. Finally, he looked down at Chloe. "You lied to me," Julian said. His voice was not a shout. It was a cold, hollow statement of absolute finality. "You lied to my family. You used my name to legitimize a scam." "Julian, we love each other," Chloe pleaded, reaching for him again. Her makeup completely destroyed, dark streaks of mascara ruining her flawless bridal aesthetic. "The money does not matter. The house does not matter." "It is not about the house, Chloe," Julian replied, his tone dripping with absolute aristocratic disdain. "It is about the fact that you are a fraud. Your entire existence is a desperate, pathetic scam." He reached into his tailored jacket pocket. The movement was sharp and definitive. He was not reaching for a handkerchief to dry her tears. He was reaching for his wallet. Julian, a man born into a world where problems were solved with swift, ruthless legal action, had completely detached himself from the emotional manipulation Chloe was trying to peddle. I stood on the stage, the heavy microphone still gripped firmly in my hand. I had dismantled the golden child charade. I had exposed the fraudulent matriarch. I had stripped the cowardly husband of his fake prestige. The grand historical mansion of their lies had been razed to the foundation. But as I looked down at the wreckage, feeling the cold, satisfying rush of absolute victory coursing through my veins, I knew there was still one final piece of business left to attend to. The feast was ruined, the guests were horrified, and it was officially time to clear the tables. I slowly raised my right hand into the air. The simple, deliberate movement drew the eyes of every single person in the ballroom. I held my hand up for a fraction of a second, letting the anticipation stretch until the tension in the room was nearly unbearable. Then I snapped my fingers. The sound was sharp, bright, and completely unmistakable. The reaction was instantaneous. The 8-piece jazz band, which had been softly playing in the background to mask the awkward, suffocating tension, stopped dead. The upright bass player instantly muted his strings. The pianist pulled his hands sharply off the keys. The sudden absolute silence that fell over the cavernous room was deafening. At the back of the hall, the heavy wooden doors to the catering kitchen swung open. The general manager of the hospitality group, a man who had been enduring Beatrice's shrieking classist demands since 6 o'clock this morning, stepped forward into the light. He looked up at the stage and gave me a crisp, professional nod of profound acknowledgement. He raised his radio to his mouth and gave a single quiet command. The entire fleet of servers moved as one, unified, relentless front. The men and women in the crisp white uniforms, the very people Beatrice and the wealthy guests had spent the entire evening degrading, marched into the dining area with military precision. They did not go to the back tables. They did not target the periphery. They marched directly to the front of the room, converging completely on the grand head table and the VIP sections reserved exclusively for Julian's wealthy family. A server stepped right up to Mrs. Sterling. Without a single word of apology, without a shred of the subservient hesitation she demanded from the working class, he reached down and smoothly pulled the gold-rimmed plate of truffle risotto right out from under her resting hands. Another server approached Julian's wealthy uncles, swiftly plucking the crystal champagne flutes straight from their fingers before they could even take another sip. The staff stacked the fine china, gathered the polished silver, and rolled up the imported silk napkins with blinding efficiency. The absolute audacity of the action sent shockwaves of pure panic through the old money crowd. In their insulated, highly privileged world, food was never taken away. Service was never revoked. They were experiencing the ultimate unforgivable social degradation. They were being actively repossessed in real time. To add insult to injury, the lighting technician up in the balcony threw the master switch. The warm, romantic golden glow of the massive crystal chandeliers abruptly cut out. In its place, the harsh, bright, clinical white house lights flooded the entire ballroom. The sudden, aggressive glare illuminated every single flaw in the room. It exposed the cheap, desperate sweat soaking through Marcus's stolen foundation. It highlighted the terrifying, undeniable reality of a foreclosure taking place right in the middle of a black tie gala. Julian's mother, Mrs. Sterling, shot up from her velvet chair as if the cushion had caught fire. Her aristocratic composure, the generational restraint she had wielded like a weapon all evening, completely evaporated into the harsh lighting. She looked down at the bare, cleared table in front of her, the reality of the stolen meal sinking in, and then she turned her furious, bulging eyes directly toward Beatrice. "You absolute, despicable fraud!" Mrs. Sterling shrieked. Her voice was no longer the quiet, cultured purr of a wealthy matriarch. It was a raw, visceral scream of pure, unadulterated outrage. "You invited my family into a foreclosed property. You fed us stolen food on stolen plates. You paraded around here dripping in fake pearls while secretly drowning in toxic debt. You are nothing but a trashy scammer." Beatrice shrank back, raising her trembling hands in a pathetic, desperate gesture of defense. "Mrs. Sterling, please, I can explain everything," Beatrice whimpered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her public execution. "Do not speak to me!" Mrs. Sterling roared, stepping forward and pointing a shaking diamond-clad finger right between Beatrice's terrified eyes. "You do not even deserve to breathe the same air as my family. You targeted my son to bail out your pathetic bankrupt bloodline. You are a disgusting, classless parasite." Chloe, desperate to salvage the smoking ruins of her fairy tale, jumped up from her chair. She reached out, attempting to grab her wealthy mother-in-law's arm in a final bid for mercy. "Margaret, please, you have to understand, we love Julian." Chloe cried, tears streaming down her face, completely destroying her meticulous bridal makeup. Mrs. Sterling spun around. The disgust radiating from her face was absolute. Without a single moment of hesitation, she raised her hand and struck Chloe directly across the face. The slap echoed through the harsh, brightly lit ballroom like a heavy whip cracking. The sheer force of the impact snapped Chloe's head violently to the side. A bright, angry red mark instantly bloomed across her cheekbone. The guests gasped loudly, stepping back in collective horror, but nobody intervened to stop the carnage. The protective, polite bubble of their high society grace had been entirely shattered. "Do not ever touch me, you disgusting little gold digger!" Mrs. Sterling spat, her chest heaving with explosive rage. Chloe stumbled backward, clutching her stinging cheek, her eyes wide with total paralyzing shock. She looked frantically toward Julian, silently begging her new husband to step in to defend her honor, to save her from his mother's devastating wrath. Julian did not move to comfort her. He stood at the head of the cleared table, staring down at the foreclosure documents still resting near the velvet box. He looked at the bank receipts, the toxic debt summaries, and the undeniable mathematical proof that his entire relationship had been a meticulously calculated financial extraction. He slowly raised his head and looked at the woman he had just sworn to spend his life with. Julian's face was entirely drained of color. The deep, genuine love that had softened his features just an hour ago was completely dead, replaced by a cold, hollow, terrifying disgust. He reached up with his right hand and tightly gripped his left ring finger. "Julian." "No." Chloe begged, her voice a shrill, desperate squeak. "Please, we can fix this. I love you. The money does not matter." "You are right about one thing," Julian said, his voice dropping into a deadly monotone whisper that cut through her sobbing. "The money does not matter to me, but it was the only thing that ever mattered to you. You used me. Your entire family used me as a lifeline because you were too cowardly to face your own miserable failures." He pulled the heavy custom-made platinum wedding band off his finger. He held it up for a fraction of a second, letting the bright, sterile house lights catch the polished metal. "The wedding is off," Julian announced. His voice was loud enough to carry to the very back of the silent, staring crowd. "I want absolutely nothing to do with this fraud, this family, or you. My lawyers will contact you in the morning to file the annulment. Do not ever try to contact me again." Julian threw the ring. He did not hand it back to her gently. He threw it directly at the marble floor with incredible force. The platinum band hit the hard stone with a sharp metallic ping that rang out like a funeral bell. It bounced twice, rolling away into the shadows under the table, discarded like a piece of worthless trash. Julian turned his back on his weeping bride. He signaled to his furious mother and his bewildered relatives. The Sterling family gathered their expensive coats and their dignity, turning away from the head table in unified, absolute disgust. They marched down the center aisle, the crowd parting silently to let the wealthy white elite exit the fraudulent stage. Chloe watched him walk away. She watched the billionaire lifestyle, the high society status, and her only financial salvation walk right out the grand oak doors. The reality of her total destruction finally crashed down upon her shoulders. Her knees buckled. Her legs simply gave out beneath the crushing weight of her massive imported lace gown. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The extravagant wedding dress, the garment she had extorted my money to purchase, pooled around her trembling body like a deflated, pathetic parachute. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as she descended into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobbing. The wails echoed off the high ceilings, a tragic, miserable soundtrack to the fall of the Beatrice dynasty. Beatrice stood frozen above her weeping daughter, completely incapable of offering any comfort. Her eyes were glazed over, staring blankly at the empty space where the Sterling family had just been standing. The generational wealth, the aristocratic connections, the elite social standing she had sacrificed her own soul to secure, had all turned to ash and slipped right through her desperate fingers. I stood on the stage watching the magnificent, brutal consequences of their own actions unfold below me. The room was bright, the tables were empty, and the truth had entirely sterilized the building. I had not laid a single hand on them. I had simply turned on the lights and let the cockroaches scatter. The devastation on the ballroom floor was absolute, but the primary target of my carefully orchestrated ruin had not yet received his final sentence. Marcus was still standing near his overturned chair, his eyes darting frantically across the wreckage of his family's social standing. He watched the Sterling family disappear through the grand oak doors. He looked down at his sister, who was currently drowning in a sea of imported French lace and her own bitter tears. He looked at his mother, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her financial and social annihilation. In that brief, pathetic moment of calculation, Marcus realized his entire world had just been entirely vaporized. The fake investment fund, the country club memberships, the endless stream of luxury cars, all of it was gone. His mother could no longer protect him. His sister could no longer elevate him. The only person in the entire room who held any actual power, any actual wealth, was the woman standing on the stage. The woman he had just publicly betrayed. The survival instinct of a desperate, cornered parasite kicked in. Marcus made the catastrophic decision to try and save himself by appealing to the very vows he had spent the last 3 years treating like garbage. He broke away from his paralyzed mother and sprinted toward the secondary stage. His polished Italian leather shoes slipped slightly on the marble floor, but he caught his balance, taking the 3 carpeted steps 2 at a time. He rushed right into my personal space, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with a manic manufactured desperation. From his perspective, looking over his broad, sweating shoulders, I must have looked like a towering monument of cold, unyielding stone. My posture was perfectly straight. My hands were resting calmly at my sides. I watched him approach with the clinical, detached fascination of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Marcus reached out with both hands and forcefully grabbed my right hand. His palms were slick with nervous sweat. His grip was tight, frantic, trying to physically tether himself to my immense wealth. He leaned in, his face contorted into a pathetic, theatrical mask of a heartbroken, misunderstood husband. "Nia, what are you doing?" Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking with a perfectly rehearsed tremor. "This has gone too far. You have made your point. You are angry and you have every right to be. But please stop this. We are husband and wife. We love each other. We can fix this together. I am on your side." The sheer staggering audacity of his words was almost impressive. He was standing in a suit paid for by my credit card mere minutes after laughing at a racist joke aimed at my face, and he actually believed he could charm his way back into my bank accounts. He thought I was just a hysterical, emotional woman acting out of temporary jealousy. He thought a few sweet words and a firm grip of my hand would instantly domesticate me back into submission. I looked down at his trembling, sweating hands gripping my fingers. A wave of profound, absolute revulsion crashed over me. I violently swatted his hands away. The physical rejection was sharp, aggressive, and incredibly loud. The harsh smack of my hand striking his wrist echoed through the silent, brightly lit ballroom. Marcus stumbled backward, his eyes widening in genuine shock as if he could not fathom that I would ever dare to physically reject his touch. "Do not ever put your hands on me again," I commanded, my voice dropping into a deadly freezing tone that stopped him dead in his tracks. I reached my hand behind my back, slipping my fingers into the hidden pocket of my tailored gown. My fingers wrapped around the smooth, heavy cardstock of the final document I had prepared for this evening. I pulled out a sleek black leather presentation folder. It was thick, heavy, and loaded with the absolute destruction of his entire future. I did not hand it to him. I threw the heavy folder straight at his chest. The sharp corner of the leather binder hit him squarely in the sternum with a dull, heavy thud. Marcus gasped, his hand scrambling reflexively to catch the folder before it hit the ground. He clutched it against his chest, his eyes darting frantically from the black leather cover back up to my face. "There is one more thing that was supposed to be in that velvet box, Marcus," I announced, ensuring my voice carried over his heavy, panicked breathing. "Open it!" Marcus's trembling fingers fumbled with the edge of the folder. He flipped the heavy cover open, his eyes locked onto the bold black text printed across the top of the very first page. His jaw physically dropped. The pathetic, hopeful illusion he had been clinging to completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but raw, inescapable terror. "Those are divorce papers," I stated clearly, driving the final nail directly into the coffin of our marriage. "And right behind them are the official certified bank statements showing the $50,000 wire transfer you requested at 6 o'clock this morning." Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He looked down at the bank statements, his eyes scanning the highlighted transaction lines. "Chloe came up to me during the reception," I continued, my voice dripping with absolute lethal precision. "She bragged about the fact that you transferred that $50,000 to her account to fund her luxurious honeymoon in the Maldives. She thought you two had successfully extorted me. She thought she had won. But what your spoiled, arrogant sister did not know, Marcus, is that I have been actively tracking every single digital movement you have made for the past 8 months." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "I know that you did not wire that money to Chloe's honeymoon fund," I said, watching the last drop of blood drain entirely from his face. "I know that you routed those funds through a dummy account and wired the entire $50,000 directly to the luxury apartment complex in Midtown to prepay a 6-month lease for your 24-year-old mistress." A loud collective gasp erupted from the few remaining guests and catering staff, who were still standing frozen around the perimeter of the room. Down below us, Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled noise, staring up at her son in absolute horror. Marcus opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a lie, trying to construct an excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The evidence was literally sitting in his hands. There was no spinning this. There was no gaslighting his way out of a certified bank ledger. "You told Chloe she could have the money just to get her off your back," I stated, laying out the pathetic reality of his betrayal. "You lied to your own sister on her wedding day. You let her walk around this ballroom bragging about money that you had already stolen to fund your filthy, pathetic affair. You are not just a terrible husband, Marcus. You are a terrible brother, a terrible son, and an absolutely worthless man." Marcus shook his head frantically, tears of genuine panic finally welling up in his eyes. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I was going to end it. I swear to God I was going to end it. The money was just a severance payment to get her to leave me alone. You have to believe me. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. I cannot lose you." "You are not losing me," I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of any mercy. "You never had me. You had a bank account. You had a shield to hide behind while you played pretend in a world you could not afford. But the bank is officially closed." I pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the divorce papers trembling in his hands. "You signed a prenuptial agreement 3 years ago," I reminded him, savoring the absolute delicious irony of this specific moment. "Do you remember that day, Marcus? You and your mother were so incredibly arrogant. You were so completely convinced that I was just a gold-digging girl from the wrong side of the tracks who was trying to steal your prestigious family legacy. You insisted on an ironclad prenup to protect your non-existent assets. You demanded a strict infidelity clause that stated if either party stepped out on the marriage, They would forfeit any and all rights to spousal support alimony or shared property. Marcus stared at me, the terrifying reality of his own arrogance crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. He had signed his own death warrant. He had built the very cage he was currently locked inside. You thought you were protecting a fortune, I said, offering him a cold, terrifying smile. But you were actually protecting my empire from yourself. You waived your right to everything. My companies, my investments, my properties. You have absolutely no legal claim to a single dime of my wealth. I stepped back, surveying the completely broken, weeping man standing before me. He was nothing. He was a hollow suit wrapped in a mountain of debt. As of this exact second, I declared, my voice ringing with final, absolute authority, you are out on the street with absolutely nothing. You do not have a house, you do not have a car, you do not have a job. You have the clothes on your back and the divorce papers in your hand. I suggest you pack a very small bag, Marcus, because when the sun comes up tomorrow, my security team will physically throw you off my property. Marcus crumpled. His knees literally gave out beneath him. He sank down onto the carpeted stage, dropping the leather folder onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. The man who had laughed at me just an hour ago was now weeping at my feet, completely and utterly destroyed. I did not offer him a hand. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on his pathetic display and looked down at the ballroom floor where his mother was currently preparing to offer her own pathetic performance of surrender. I turned my attention away from the pathetic weeping shell of the man I used to call my husband. My heels clicked against the wooden stairs with a sharp, rhythmic finality as I descended from the secondary stage, stepping back down onto the main ballroom floor. The harsh, unforgiving White House lights illuminated every square inch of the devastation I had just orchestrated. There were no shadows left to hide in. There was no romantic golden ambiance to mask the profound, catastrophic failure of this family. I walked slowly, deliberately, leaving Marcus to drown in the absolute ruin of his own making. My focus was now entirely locked onto the woman who had engineered this entire nightmare from the very beginning. Beatrice was standing near the head table, completely paralyzed among the ruins of her fake empire. The deep red vintage wine she had spilled earlier was now seeping aggressively into the hem of her expensive emerald silk gown, staining the luxurious fabric like a dark, expanding bruise. Her perfectly constructed matriarchal facade, the arrogant, untouchable persona she had wielded like a weapon for decades, had entirely melted away. As I closed the distance between us, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier, charged with the undeniable electricity of a shifting power dynamic. The few catering staff members who had remained in the room stepped back, clearing a wide, respectful path for me. They watched with absolute silent reverence as the woman they had seen treated like a common servant just an hour ago now moved with the terrifying, untouchable authority of a reigning monarch. Beatrice watched me approach. Her eyes, previously so sharp and full of vicious classist judgment, were now wide, glassy pools of absolute terror. She looked past me, her frantic gaze darting toward the grand oak doors where Julian and the Sterling family had exited. She was watching her golden ticket into the white old money aristocracy disappear forever into the Atlanta night. Then she looked up at the stage where her golden boy Marcus was currently crying into the carpet, completely stripped of his fake financial prestige and facing total destitution. Finally, she looked at Chloe, her precious heiress daughter, who was still hyperventilating on the floor in a puddle of imported French lace. Beatrice was completely, utterly alone, surrounded only by the colossal wreckage of her own staggering arrogance. The realization physically broke her. It did not just break her pride, it shattered her entire posture. Beatrice let out a loud, wretched, guttural wail that tore through her throat, a sound so raw and ugly it made the remaining guests physically flinch. Her knees simply buckled beneath her. She dropped to the hard, polished marble floor right in the middle of the ballroom. The loud, heavy thud of her knees striking the stone echoed across the silent room, like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, towering over her, looking down at the woman who had made it her absolute life mission to make me feel small. From this angle, staring down at her trembling shoulders and her ruined wine-stained dress, she looked incredibly pathetic. The imposing, terrifying mother-in-law who used to dictate my every move had vanished. She looked exactly like what she had always been beneath the fake pearls and the stolen luxury, a terrified, hollow, deeply insecure woman who had sold her soul for a status she could never actually earn. I looked down at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a predator observing its conquered prey. Beatrice scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She crawled right up to my feet, completely abandoning whatever tiny fraction of dignity she had left. She reached out with shaking manicured hands, her fingers desperately clamping down onto the dark, exquisite fabric of my custom haute couture gown. She gripped the hem of my dress like a drowning sailor clinging to a life raft in the middle of a raging hurricane. She buried her face against my legs, her tears soaking into the expensive material. "Nia, please." Beatrice sobbed, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical screech that grated against the quiet room. "Please do not do this to me. You cannot take my home. You cannot throw me out into the street. I am an old woman. I have nowhere else to go. How will I survive out there?" I looked down at her white-knuckled grip on my dress. I did not pull away. I let her hold on, forcing her to feel the immense, crushing weight of the power dynamic she had so violently underestimated. I wanted her to feel exactly how helpless she truly was. "Please, Nia. I am begging you on my hands and knees." Beatrice cried, hot tears streaming down her heavily contoured face, cutting thick, ugly tracks through her expensive makeup. "Do not humiliate me like this. Not in front of everyone. Not in front of Julian's family. You have to call them back. They will ruin me in this city. I will be an absolute laughingstock. The country club will revoke my membership. My friends in the charity league will never speak to me again. You have to fix this. You have all this money. You own the bank. You can pay off the debt. You can make them come back and pretend none of this ever happened." Her delusion was staggering. Even now, kneeling in a puddle of spilled wine on the floor of a foreclosed mansion, her primary concern was not the destruction of her son's marriage or the criminal fraud she had committed against her own daughter-in-law. Her only concern was her social standing. She was still terrified of what the wealthy white elite would think of her. She was begging the black woman she had degraded all evening to use her hidden wealth to buy back the approval of the racists who had just spat in her face. The sickness of her vanity was a terminal disease, and I had absolutely no intention of offering her a cure. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I felt only the clean, purifying fire of absolute justice. I slowly reached down. I did not reach for her hands to comfort her. I reached past her trembling, pathetic form, extending my arm toward the polished hardwood floor just a few feet away. My fingers brushed against the thick white cotton fabric of the catering apron I had discarded earlier in the evening. I picked it up, feeling the heavy utilitarian weight of the uniform she had maliciously forced me to wear to strip me of my humanity. I stood back up to my full height, holding the crisp white apron in my right hand. I looked down at Beatrice, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving granite. I tossed the apron directly onto her. The heavy white fabric fluttered down through the air, landing squarely over her head and shoulders, burying her fake emerald silk under the stark, undeniable symbol of working-class labor. She flinched as the fabric hit her, letting out a sharp, pathetic gasp, but she did not dare remove it. She stayed kneeling beneath the apron, trembling violently at my feet. "You were right, Beatrice," I said. My voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried the lethal, freezing impact of an avalanche echoing with absolute authority across the ruined ballroom. "This table is for family, not for me." I let the words sink deep into her brain, throwing her own vicious classist insult right back into her face. The ultimate irony of her own cruelty had finally come full circle to crush her. She let out a muffled, pathetic sob from underneath the white cotton apron, her hands still clutching the hem of my gown in pure desperation. I smoothly stepped backward effortlessly, pulling my expensive dress right out of her frantic grip. She fell forward slightly, her hands grasping at empty air, her forehead nearly touching the polished marble floor. "Now clean up your trash," I commanded, my tone stripped of any remaining warmth or negotiation. You have 30 minutes before my security kicks everyone who does not belong out of my house. I did not wait for her response. I did not need to hear another pathetic whining excuse or another desperate plea for mercy. I turned my back on the weeping matriarch, stepping away from the shattered crystal, the spilled wine, and the total unmitigated destruction of the Grand Oak wedding. The empire of lies she had spent decades building had been completely leveled to the ground in less than an hour, and I was the one holding the deed to the ashes. I walked out of that shattered ballroom without ever looking back, leaving the smoking ruins of their fake dynasty behind me in the dust. The cool night air of Atlanta washed over my face as I stepped out of the historic mansion, carrying the sweet, undeniable scent of absolute victory. The desperate wails of my former mother-in-law and the pathetic sobs of my ex-husband faded into nothingness. The memory of their total destruction blurs and dissolves, shifting smoothly back to the present moment. I breathe in the crisp, filtered air of my penthouse, sinking deeper into the plush cushions of my emerald green velvet sofa. The heavy, chaotic noise of that catastrophic wedding has been entirely replaced by the breathtaking absolute silence of true, undeniable power. My sanctuary is perfectly still. The city lights continue to glitter silently through the floor-to-ceiling glass, a vast, sprawling kingdom that I conquered entirely on my own terms. I raise my crystal glass, watching the deep red vintage wine catch the dim, sophisticated lighting of my living room. I take one final, deliberate sip, letting the rich, complex flavor settle on my tongue. The satisfaction is immense. It is the taste of pure, unadulterated justice. I slowly lower the glass from my lips and look directly forward, piercing the empty space ahead with a cold, sharp, and deeply unforgiving smile. They thought I was just a pawn to run their errands. They did not know I was the one buying the entire chessboard. Never underestimate the woman standing in the shadows pouring your wine. The luxurious room around me begins to dim, fading smoothly into total consuming blackness. The very last sound that echoes through the cold, dark silence is the sharp, definitive clink of my crystal wine glass being set firmly onto the marble table.